let's dive into one of the biggest, most mind-bending economic puzzles of our time. It's a story about unimaginable wealth, a truly epic collapse, and why, believe it or not, it still has a huge impact on all of us.
Right, this is the question that's at the heart of everything. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, does it? When you think oil, you think power, you think money. But Venezuela's story completely flips that script. So how is this even possible?
Okay, let's start with the sheer scale of it all, because it's hard to even wrap your head around. Over 300 billion barrels. Just let that number sink in. That's the amount of proven oil reserves sitting right under Venezuelan soil. It's an almost unimaginable amount of wealth.
And here's where the paradox really gets crazy. We're not just talking about a lot of oil. We are talking about the most oil, more than the entire kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So, knowing that, the question of what went wrong becomes so much more urgent. To really get to the bottom of this, we need to understand our first key insight. It's a concept that sounds completely backwards, but it is absolutely central to this whole story. People often call it the paradox of plenty.
The theory is fascinating, really. It's called the resource curse, and it suggests that having a ton of a valuable natural resource could actually backfire. A country gets so dependent on that one thing that it stops developing other parts of its economy, and that makes it incredibly vulnerable when prices swing or when things are mismanaged. This idea, it's the foundation for everything that happened next.
So how did this curse actually play out in dollars and cents? Well, that brings us to our second big insight. You see, it wasn't just about having the oil. It was about what Venezuela did with the promise of that oil. The best way to think about it is like the Great Chinese Mortgage.
Yeah, all that wealth didn't just disappear into thin air. It was traded away years and years in advance through a whole series of incredibly complex and massive financial deals.
And this was the main tool they used, the oil-backed loan. The idea is simple, but really dangerous. Instead of getting a loan and paying it back with cash, you promise to pay it back with a physical thing. In this case, millions upon millions of barrels of oil that you haven't even drilled yet.
So this partnership, it became the financial engine for the entire country for years. You had China on one side needing massive amounts of energy, and they saw golden opportunity. And on the other side, you had Venezuela desperate for cash, who saw a lender that was willing to play ball. The result? One of the biggest resource for loan deals in modern history.
And look at these numbers, they are just staggering. Through these special funds, China pumped over $40 billion into Venezuela. But this wasn't a gift. Every single dollar was basically an advance secured by future oil shipments from PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company.
So in the simplest terms, Venezuela took out a gigantic mortgage on its most valuable asset. The loan payments weren't made in dollars. They were made in oil tankers, sailing for China day after day, year after year. This meant that even when oil prices were sky high, a huge chunk of that oil was already sold. It was just going to pay down the debt.
Okay, so a ton of money was flowing in. But that brings up the next big question, and it's our third key insight. Where in the world did all that money actually go?
On paper, the vision was just breathtaking. These billions were supposed to pay for a total modernization of the country. We're talking brand new metro systems, railways that would cross the continent, new power plants. They were even building things like high-tech satellites. The plan was a complete national transformation.
But the reality? Well, it was a world away from the dream. This quote right here from a report on the Tanaco-Anaco Railway project, it just says it all. That project, like so many others, was just left to rot, becoming a massive, useless monument to failed ambition, a red elephant.
And this picture really captures that disconnect. You know, a few flashy, high-profile projects like this satellite actually got finished. But the huge infrastructure projects, the ones that were supposed to be the new backbone of the economy, they mostly failed. They just swallowed billions and billions of dollars with almost nothing to show for it in the end.
So that brings us to our fourth insight, which is all about the situation right now. Because after all the debt, the failed projects, and the economic collapse, the oil is still there. Venezuela is still a sleeping oil giant, but waking it up is a huge, huge challenge.
Now, one thing you've got to understand is that not all oil is created equal. A lot of Venezuela's oil, especially in this massive area called the Orinoco Belt, is extra heavy. The easiest way to think about it is like molasses, while conventional oil is more like olive oil. Getting this thick, tar-like stuff out of the ground and refining it is really hard and incredibly expensive. You need massive long-term investment, which has been pretty much impossible to find.
But if you want proof that oil is still the only game in town, just look at this data. It's so telling. Back in 2020, under heavy sanctions, Venezuela's top exports to China were things like iron and steel. Now, watch what happens by 2024 after some of those sanctions were eased. Bam! Oil and bitumen immediately snapped right back to the #1 spot, by a massive margin. It shows you the second it gets a chance, the giant starts to stir. That potential is always just waiting right below the surface.
And this all builds to our final and maybe the most important insight for the rest of us. After everything that's happened, why does Venezuela's oil still matter so much?
Here's the key takeaway. It's not about the oil Venezuela is producing today, it's about the oil it could produce tomorrow. The sheer size of its reserves, it hangs like a shadow over the entire global energy market. The potential for Venezuela to one day flood the world with cheap, heavy oil makes other oil-producing countries very, very nervous. And to see just how big a threat that is, just compare Venezuela to another big heavy oil producer, Canada. Venezuelan oil is just a short, cheap boat ride away from all those huge refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast that are designed to process it. Canadian oil has to travel thousands of miles through expensive pipelines or on trains. So if Venezuela ever gets its act together and gets the investment to ramp up production, it could crush competitors on price and logistics. It would completely reshape the energy map. So when we boil this whole thing down, what have we really learned? First, having a ton of resources doesn't automatically make you powerful. Sometimes it's a curse. Second, in the great game of geopolitics, energy is about control and leverage, not just about profits. And finally, and this one is so important, the potential to produce oil, just the threat of future supply, can be just as powerful in the global market as the oil that's actually flowing today.
And that leaves us all with one final, critical question. With the largest oil reserves on the entire planet just sitting there, dormant, is Venezuela's oil some kind of buried treasure? Or is it a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off and disrupt the entire global energy market? The answer to that could very well define the next decade of energy politics.